April 25th, 1945. Berlin is falling. 30 meters below the streets of a city consuming itself in fire and collapse, a man in a general's uniform is burning documents, not quickly, not in a panic, methodically, page by page, with the particular care of someone who understands exactly what they are destroying. He has been here for 6 hours. His adjutant stands at the door, reporting that Soviet forces are less than 12 kilometers away. The man does not respond. He feeds another folder into the flame, watches it curl, watches it go black, watches it disappear. What is in these documents? That is the question that researchers, intelligence analysts, and historians have been asking for 8 decades, not because the documents survived, they didn't, but because of what other documents, the ones that weren't burned, the ones recovered in the chaos of a collapsing Reich, refer to, in passing, in footnotes, in coded shorthand. They reference a program without a public name, a program described in interdepartmental memos only as das Nichtmenschliche Project, the non-human project, not a weapons program, not an intelligence operation, something categorized separately from everything else, something that sat in a bureaucratic space of its own, outside the normal chain of command, outside the normal classification system, answering to a very small circle of people at the very top of one of history's most obsessive regimes. And then, in the spring of 1945, someone decided it had to disappear, not archived, not transferred, disappeared. You have to ask yourself, in a regime that documented everything, that catalogued prisoners by the millions, that kept meticulous records of every bullet spent and every train scheduled, what would compel them, in their final hours, to burn this? What could be so dangerous that it had to be erased from existence? Most people, when they hear about the Ahnenerbe, think of mythology, of occultists in SS uniforms chasing the Holy Grail through medieval manuscripts. And while that image is not entirely wrong, it is dangerously incomplete. The Ahnenerbe Forschungs- und Lehrgemeinschaft, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, was founded in 1935. Officially, it was a think tank, an academic body, a collection of scholars dedicated to researching Germanic prehistory. Unofficially, it was one of the most heavily funded scientific organizations in the Third Reich. With over 50 departments, more than 100 active research projects, and a budget that, by 1939, exceeded that of many legitimate universities, the Ahnenerbe was not a fringe operation. It was a machine. And that machine had a mandate that went far beyond collecting Norse myths. At its core, the Ahnenerbe was searching for something specific, something that can be described, in modern scientific language, as ancestral genetic markers, biological evidence of an original, racially pure population that they believed had seeded all of human civilization. They called these people the Uras, the primal race, and they believed that within the living descendants of this population there existed dormant genetic information, blueprint-level biological data, encoded in the blood, in the cells, waiting to be unlocked. This was not purely mystical thinking, it was pseudoscience, dressed in the clothing of legitimate biology. And some of the scientists involved were not pseudoscientists. That's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Their intellectual headquarters was Wewelsburg Castle in the hills of Westphalia. Himmler had acquired it in 1934 and begun transforming it not into a military base, not into a residence, but into something that one architectural historian described as a temple of ideology dressed as a medieval fortress. The North Tower was the inner sanctum. Beneath it, a circular crypt. Above it, a great hall with 12 seats arranged around a round table, an explicit, deliberate echo of Arthurian legend. This was their Black Camelot, a place where the quest was not for territory or resources. The quest was for something that, if the documents that survived are to be believed, they thought was encoded in human biology itself. In Wewelsburg's archives, what remained of them after the castle's SS commander ordered it partially demolished. In 1945, researchers found references to biological research protocols, to sample collections, to genetic comparisons being conducted under academic cover. The Ahnenerbe was not just studying history. They were looking for something in the human body that they believed history had left behind. So, what did they mean by non-human? This is where the evidence requires careful, precise handling, because the term appears in surviving documents in ways that are both clinically specific and deliberately obscure, and unpacking it requires a brief but necessary detour into the biology they were attempting to exploit. By the early 1940s, Nazi racial science, officially known as Rassenkunde, had moved well beyond crude anthropological measurement. The more serious researchers within the Ahnenerbe's biological division were engaging with real emerging science, with genetics, with what we would now call phenotypic expression, the way genes manifest in physical and behavioral traits, and with the early, incomplete understanding of what we now call mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. It doesn't recombine the way other genetic material does, which means it carries an unbroken record, a biological chain of custody stretching back thousands of generations. In the early 1940s, the full implications of this weren't understood, but some Ahnenerbe researchers were close enough to the concept to find it extraordinarily significant. Their theory, reconstructed from fragments, from surviving correspondence, from post-war testimonies of scientists who worked adjacent to these programs, was this: that within isolated human populations that had experienced minimal genetic mixing over thousands of years, there existed what their documents called schlummend Merkmale, dormant markers, traits that were present in the genome but not expressed, suppressed by evolution, or in their language, suppressed by degeneration. And the non-human designation, it appears to refer to individuals and populations in which these dormant markers were expressed, not metaphorically, biologically. People who exhibited phenotypic characteristics that their framework classified as belonging to the Urasei characteristics, so distinct from the modern human baseline that their taxonomy placed them in a separate classification, non-human. Not as a slur, though slurs were certainly used, as a category, a scientific category within their internal classification system. This is where it gets genuinely disturbing, because the implication supported by what we know of their experimental protocols is that they weren't just cataloguing these individuals. They were studying what had switched those traits on, what biological or environmental conditions had activated what should have been dormant, and whether that activation could be replicated. Whether, in other words, the non-human state could be manufactured. That question, that specific, targeted, terrifying question, is what the non-human project appears to have been designed to answer. To find their answers, they went to the edges of the world. The Ahnenerbe's expeditions are perhaps the most documented and most misunderstood aspect of their operation. The 1938 Tibet expedition, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer, is often reduced to a punchline: Nazis measuring Tibetan skulls, looking for Aryan ancestors in the Himalayas. But the physical anthropological work was a cover story, or at best, a secondary objective. The primary mission was sample collection. Biological material from populations that the Ahnenerbe had identified as genetically isolated populations in which the diluting effect of centuries of migration and interbreeding had been minimized, the Tibetan Plateau, the indigenous populations of the Andes, certain communities in the Caucasus Mountains. These were not chosen randomly. They were chosen because, according to the Ahnenerbe's own internal population genetics framework, they were the closest approximation to an uncontaminated ancestral baseline. Living archives of genetic information that the modern world had, in their view, overwritten. The samples collected blood, tissue, skeletal material, hair were returned to Germany, to facilities that, in the official record, don't exist. And then there is Antarctica. The German Antarctic expedition of 1938-1939 aboard the Schwabenland is documented. Its official purpose was to survey territory for a potential whaling base, but the expedition's classified components, referenced in post-war Allied intelligence assessments, suggest a secondary mission that went beyond cartography. The region they surveyed, known as New Schwabenland, now Dronning-Maud-Land, contained something the expedition's leadership considered significant. What exactly has never been fully declassified. But the theories that have emerged, some credible, some wildly speculative, cluster around a single concept: the possibility of a permanent, concealed installation. What some researchers call Base 211. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is where documented history and unverified theory intersect, and conflating them does a disservice to both. What we know: the Schwabenland expedition collected geological and geographical data. Its classified files have never been fully released. Post-war, several German U-boats surrendered in South American ports after extended periods unaccounted for their commanders citing special missions in the South Atlantic. What we don't know: whether any permanent installation was established, whether it was related to the biological programs, whether the samples collected globally ever arrived somewhere that the Allied forces never found. What we do know: when Allied forces swept through Germany's research facilities in the spring of 1945, they found evidence of programs that should have had physical infrastructure, laboratories, cold storage, specimen archives that was simply not there. Something had been moved, or destroyed, or both. This is the part of the story that requires the most careful telling, because what the surviving evidence suggests, and I want to be transparent, that we are working from fragments, from recovered correspondence, from post-war testimonies, given under conditions of varying reliability. What it suggests is that in the final years of the war, within facilities operating under Ahnenerbe oversight, a series of experiments were conducted that went beyond anything in the publicly acknowledged record of Nazi medical crimes, not in scale, in intent. The Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946-1947 documented in harrowing detail the medical experiments conducted in camps, experiments that were, in their own horrific way, relatively conventional in their structure. They tested human endurance, they tested disease, they tested pharmaceutical responses. Monstrous, yes, but within a recognizable framework of cause and effect. What the non-human project appears to have been doing was categorically different. Based on what can be reconstructed, the experiments centered on what their documentation called Zwangsevolution, forced evolution, the attempt to artificially induce the expression of dormant phenotypic traits, to switch on, through chemical, biological, and environmental intervention, characteristics that the researchers believed existed in suppressed form within specific human genotypes. In modern terms, they were attempting to activate silent genes. The mechanisms they used, again, reconstructed from fragments, appear to have included epigenetic stress protocols. The emerging science of epigenetics, the study of how environmental factors can switch genes on or off, without altering the underlying DNA sequence, was in its infancy in the 1940s. But some of the Ahnenerbe's biological researchers appear to have been working with concepts that anticipated this science by decades. Their protocols involved subjecting subjects to controlled extreme stressors, environmental, chemical, physiological, in the belief that sufficient stress could force latent genetic expressions to emerge. Hormonal and endocrine manipulation. The endocrine system, the body's hormonal communication network, is now understood to play a significant role in gene expression. Their experiments appear to have involved the injection of extracted biological compounds, some synthesized, some derived from the samples collected on their global expeditions, in an attempt to chemically signal dormant genetic sequences, selective pressure environments. Perhaps the most chilling component, the creation of controlled environments designed to simulate the conditions under which they believed the Uras had originally expressed these traits. Deprivation, isolation, atmospheric manipulation, the attempt to recreate, artificially, the evolutionary pressures that they believed had once produced the characteristics they were searching for. What were they trying to produce? Here, the evidence becomes its most fragmentary. But the language in surviving references terms like erweiterte Wahrnehmung, expanded perception, strukturelle Überlegenheit, structural superiority, and the recurring, unexplained notation NM Schwelle, the non-human threshold, suggests they believed they were on the verge of something that went beyond conventional eugenics. They weren't trying to breed a better soldier, they were trying to produce something they believed had existed before, something that evolution or degeneration, in their framework, had buried. Whether they succeeded is a question the burned documents have rendered permanently unanswerable. But the fact that someone decided to burn them methodically in the final hours of a collapsing regime, when every other priority was escape and survival, suggests that something was considered worth erasing. And things that are worth erasing are rarely things that failed entirely. The war ended in May 1945. The Nuremberg trials began in November, and quietly in the months between those two events, something remarkable and troubling happened. A number of German scientists, many of them directly implicated in programs that would have qualified as war crimes, disappeared from the Allied custody lists. Not escaped, disappeared, with help. Operation Paperclip is now publicly acknowledged. The American program that recruited German rocket scientists, engineers, and aerospace technicians for the emerging space race. We know about Werner von Braun. We know about the V-2 engineers who became the architects of NASA. What is far less publicly documented is the biological counterpart. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the body that administered Paperclip, had a medical and biological division. Its files, many of which were not declassified until the 1990s, and some of which remain partially redacted, contain the names of German biological and medical researchers who were recruited, sanitized, and absorbed into American scientific institutions. Some of these researchers had documented connections to the Ahnenerbe's biological programs. The Soviet Union was running a parallel operation, what historians now call Operation Osoaviakim, in its technical dimension, that similarly swept up German scientific talent in the immediate post-war period. Both superpowers were doing the same thing, racing to acquire the same people, the same knowledge. The question that nobody in official history has fully answered is, what knowledge, specifically, were they racing for? Here's what we can say with documented certainty. Within a decade of the war's end, both the United States and the Soviet Union were running classified biological research programs that pushed well beyond the publicly acknowledged boundaries of science at the time. Programs that involved genetic research, behavioral modification, psychological experimentation documented, in the American case, through the eventual disclosure of MKUltra and related programs. The official narrative presents these programs as products of Cold War paranoia, of the arms race applied to the human mind and body. But consider the timeline. The biological research infrastructure being built in the late 1940s required more than just inspiration. It required knowledge, protocols, prior experimental data, the kind of data that takes years to develop unless you inherit it from somewhere, unless someone ran the early experiments for you. The biological space race, the race to understand and potentially control human biological potential at the genetic level, did not begin with the discovery of DNA's double helix in 1953. It did not begin with the first cloning experiments of the 1970s. The evidence suggests it began in a bunker, in a set of programs that someone decided, in the final hours of a dying empire, had to be burned. Not preserved, not surrendered, not archived. Burned. Let me bring you back to that bunker. April 1945. A man feeding documents into a flame, page by page, with extraordinary care. We don't know his name with certainty. We don't know exactly which facility this was. We reconstruct the scene from accounts that are themselves partial, filtered through the chaos of a civilization in free fall. But we know this: the documents he burned were considered, by someone with significant authority, to be more dangerous than whatever fate awaited him if he was caught by advancing Allied forces. He stayed. He burned. He made sure. There is a specific category of scientific knowledge that becomes dangerous not when it is used, but when it is known to be possible. The atomic bomb crossed that threshold in July 1945, once Trinity detonated in the New Mexico desert. The question was no longer whether it could be done, only who would do it next and when. The non-human project represents a different and in some ways more unsettling threshold. If the experiments produced results, even partial results, even inconclusive results, then the same knowledge calculus applies. The question is no longer whether dormant human genetic potential can be artificially expressed. It becomes, who is continuing that research? Under what framework? With what oversight? And the uncomfortable answer, the one that historical evidence and the trajectory of modern classified biological research both point toward, is that the work did not end in a burning bunker in April 1945. It relocated. We live in an era of CRISPR gene editing, of epigenetic therapy, of a level of biological engineering capability that would have seemed like mythology to the scientists of 1945. We use this technology, overwhelmingly, for genuine and profound benefit fighting disease, understanding hereditary conditions, pushing the boundaries of medicine. But the tools are the tools. And tools built with public funding, in peer-reviewed institutions, with ethical oversight, those are the ones we know about. What about the others? What about the programs that operate in the space between official science and classified research? The space where, historically, the most consequential and the most morally catastrophic developments have occurred? We don't know. And that not knowing, that deliberate, bureaucratic, institutional not knowing, is perhaps the most direct legacy of what was burned in that bunker. Because the man who burned those documents understood something that we would do well to remember. The most powerful ideas are not destroyed by fire. They are transformed by it. They go underground. They resurface, later, elsewhere, in forms that are cleaner and better funded and harder to question. The non-human project, whatever it was, did not end in 1945. It only changed its name. The next question, the one that I think is the most important, and the one we'll be exploring in our next video, is where that name appears next. In the Cold War, programs that pushed biological research past its publicly acknowledged limits. In the intersection between the scientists who vanished from Allied custody and the classified programs that emerged, fully formed, in the decades that followed, The story doesn't end in 1945. It's still being written. If this video made you think, if it made you uncomfortable in the way that good history should I want to hear from you, drop your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story surprised you the most? What question do you want us to answer next? This is a community built on asking the hard questions, and your engagement directly shapes what we investigate next. And if you're not subscribed to Steel and Strategy yet, this is the moment. We cover history's most complex, most hidden, and most consequential stories with the depth they deserve. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of a community that doesn't look away. The next video is coming, and you won't want to miss it.